prophets of Baal. Don't let any of them get away. So the people captured the prophets and took them to the Kishon River, where Elijah killed every one of them. 450 prophets. Defenseless, they were prophets. Elisha was the successor of Elijah, and all of the Spirit of God that was there with Elijah was actually conferred onto Elisha. Elisha was actually a great worker of miracles. Some of the miracles that are attributed to Jesus in the New Testament are somewhat, in some small way, rivaled by Elisha, because Elisha also raised a dead person back to life. 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 23 to 24. Again, thinking about religious tolerance, we heard about no freedom in Saudi Arabia. Well, yes, of course, that is a problem, and Muslims shouldn't agree with that. We should actually promote freedom and democracy. That, to me, is in line with Quranic teaching. And what they do in Saudi Arabia, I don't need to defend. There are, just as Dave was saying, there are good Christians and bad Christians. Well, there are good Muslims and bad Muslims. There are people who follow the true teachings and people who do not. And it is interesting that Dave, in speaking about Muslim activities, would blame all of the activities of Muslims on the Quran, but then in speaking of the fact, as he has documented in his own book, that Christians slaughtered so many Jews and fellow Christians and so on, he says, okay, those are not real Christians. Okay, so then let's be fair and do it the same way for both books. But then, if we are to read the scriptures, and notice that so far I'm just simply reading the scriptures. Dave had actually put before us the plan that we're not to cite scholars, because, of course, the scholars are not dependable. And then immediately after having said that, he was conscious of the need to break his own rule, and he said that. And then if one listens carefully, one would see that throughout his speech, he actually continued to break his rule, even up to the end when he cited, I believe it was Paul, what was it, Wilson? What's the scholar that you cited, Dave? What was his name? Robert Wilson, yes. Yes, even up to towards the end of your speech. So it is clear then that to say one thing and announce it as an ideal is easy, but then to follow it might be actually very difficult. Well then, what does the Bible say that Elisha did? And we were looking at 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 23 to 24. And Elisha went up from thence unto Bethel. And as he was going up by the way, there came forth little children out of the city, and mocked him, and said to him, Go up, thou bald head. Sorry, no offense meant to all you guys here. I know you all got here. No offense, Mike. So he was going up to Bethel, and these little children come out mocking him and saying, Go up, thou bald head. Go up, thou bald head. And he turned back and looked on them and cursed them in the name of the Lord. And there came forth 2 she-bears out of the wood, and tare 42 children of them. Tore up 42 children. It looks like God was in cooperation with Elijah to send the bears to maul these 32, how many were them? 42 children. Doesn't look very good. Of course, many Christians realize that, again, I said, let's look at the texts intertextually but also contextually. As Dave said, these texts were written by many people over a long stretch of time. How do we know what beliefs they had, what attitudes they had, how they grew up, what kinds of experiences they had? It is clear that Dave and I have 2 different experiences. And I can respect Dave, even though I disagree with what he says, because I can well imagine that if I had a similar set of life experiences as Dave had, I might have said the same things tonight that he said. And if we have that understanding, then we can appreciate and respect each other even though we have differences. But we should also be aware that the biblical writers, some of them writing 1,000, 2,000 years ago, not 1,000, definitely 2,000 years ago, they had a different set of experiences, and they wrote according to these experiences that they had. Some of them were inspired by God. They felt the power of God moving in them and inspiring them to write, and this is what they wrote. But that does not mean that this is definitive for what we are going to practice today. And most Christians have the better sense to not follow the passages the way they are described here. We can rise above that. But that is my point. Whether it is the Quran or the Bible, we must recognize that there are certain passages which have more to do with the time than they have to do with our present times, and we should note the difference and apply the passages accordingly. Women. One of the things that the Quran is being accused of in modern times is being anti-women. And the implication seems to be that, look, we have another book, the Bible, which is actually very good for women, and so we should reject the Quran and choose the Bible. Actually, my experience is quite the opposite. If one were to look, for example, at the story of Eve, in the Quran and in the Bible, one will see that in the Quran, Eve is not blamed anywhere for the sin of Adam. In fact, Adam is specifically blamed. And they're both said to have been, in a way, deceived by the devil. They're caused to, rather not both deceived. The devil caused both of them to slip from the garden in which they had their security. But the one who is singled out for blame in the Quran is Adam. In chapter 20, verse number 119, 120. It says, فَعَصَىٰ آدَمُ رَبَّهُ. Adam disobeyed his Lord. Of course, the story in the Quran is not one about original sin, but about original forgiveness, about an original lesson. The Quranic story tells us basically that when you sin, if you turn back to God, God will forgive you as He forgave our first parents. But in the Bible, of course, we know from Genesis chapter 3 that the woman was blamed. And Adam's fault was that he listened to his wife and took the fruit and ate it from her. And that is followed through in the New Testament. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses number 3 to 10. Let me start with verse number 11. A woman must quietly receive instruction with entire submissiveness. But I do not allow a woman to teach or... Actually, hold on, I've mixed up my quotes here. So, this is actually 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 11. A woman must quietly receive instruction with entire submissiveness, but I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet. For it was Adam who was first created, and then Eve. And it was not Adam who was deceived, but the woman, being deceived, fell into transgression. But women will be preserved through the bearing of children if they continue in faith and love and sanctity with self-restraint. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses number 11 forward. I find that text a little bit puzzling because I thought the general plan was that everybody gets saved by the fact that Jesus died for our sins. It seems that this passage is pointing out that women have a very different plan of salvation. Women will be saved through childbearing. But what is equally troubling is the idea that the man was not deceived. It was the woman who was deceived. And when we think back about the Samson story, it was Delilah who betrays him. And when one thinks back about all of the stories in the Bible, one finds that Sarah and Delilah, and it looks like women are always being painted in a bad light in the Bible, or should we say mostly painted in a bad light. And we must ask why this is so. But I found it equally disturbing that Dave actually cited this passage with great ease. He has no problem with saying that it wasn't the man who was deceived, it was the woman who was deceived. And of course, women have been blamed for all of the ills of men. Somebody said that's why they're called women, woe to men. Anyway, that's... Now, what is the reason for the women's covering? In the Islamic faith, the Quran says that the women should draw a part of their outer garments over themselves, لِيُعْرَفْنَ فَلَا يُؤْذَيْنَ. That's in chapter 33 of the Quran, so that they should be known and not molested. It seems that from the context of that passage, there were hypocrites in Medina, the city of the Prophet, who were harassing the women. And when they were asked about that, they were giving some excuses. They were saying, we didn't know these were our women, and so on. So the Quran was just simply advising the women that if they were to gather their garments in a particular way, they would be recognized in that society as decent, upright women, ones who would not mess around, and that would rob the hypocrites of the one excuse which they had. On the other hand, the Quran promised the hypocrites, or rather threatened them, that if they do not stop their ill behavior, they will be driven out from the area. So the purpose of the woman's head covering seems to be then that she guards herself from being molested by people who might be looking out for a quick encounter. What is the purpose in the Bible then for a head cover? 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses number 3 to 10. That's where I began, and here are the verses now. Paul writes and says, "But I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every woman, and the man is the head of a woman, And God is the head of Christ. Every man who has something on his head while praying or prophesying disgraces his head. But every woman who has her head uncovered while